Ruthless Alpha King bought rejected pregnant Omega at auction, then fell in love. That's the talk riding the wind through every saloon and feed store from here to the high country. Folks say the man is the coldest cattle baron alive, never lifted a hand for anyone but himself. And yet, with $1 he claimed a woman no one else would touch, and the unborn child she carries. But this is no act of mercy. Somewhere in that swollen river beyond the cottonwoods lies a secret: land, water, and a claim that could break his enemies or bury him with them. The snow's still falling, the church bell's still tolling, and the riders shadowing the ridge ain't here to wish him well. What's a man to do when the woman he bought holds the one thing he spent his life fighting for, and the one thing that could cost him everything? Will he fight to keep her, or fight to let her go? This channel isn't just about stories. It's about remembering what still holds value: empathy, truth, and the courage to care. The winter wind cut through the auction yard like a knife, carrying both snow and whispers across the gathered crowd. The townsfolk huddled together, their boots stamping against the cold wooden platform, breaths visible in the crisp air. Sheriff Harlan's weathered face remained stoic as he guided Mara forward, his hand gentle but firm on her arm. Mara's simple dress did little to hide her swollen belly, but she walked with remarkable dignity. Her dark eyes, a testament to her mixed heritage, surveyed the crowd without flinching from their judgmental stares. The whispers of half-breed seemed to bounce off her like the snowflakes that settled on her shawl. King McAllister stood apart from the others, his imposing frame wrapped in a heavy buffalo coat that set him apart as surely as his reputation did. His foreman, Thompson, shifted uncomfortably beside him. "Boss," Thompson muttered, "ain't our concern." Just another debt sale. But King's attention remained fixed on Mara. There was something in the way she held herself, a quiet strength that spoke of more than just pride. His years of reading people, of surviving in this harsh territory, told him there was more to this woman than met the eye. Sheriff Harlan cleared his throat, his voice carrying across the yard. "By order of the Territorial Court, we're here to settle the outstanding debts of the late James Hanley. His widow and all associated property are to be sold to the highest bidder." A ripple of cruel laughter spread through the crowd when the opening bid was announced at 25 cents. King watched as color rose in Mara's cheeks, but still she didn't lower her gaze. 30 cents! Someone called out. 35! The jeers grew louder with each bid, the crowd treating it more like entertainment than a sale of human life. King's jaw tightened, his gloved hand flexing at his side. 40 cents! Came another call, followed by a crude joke about getting a 2-for-1 deal, referring to her unborn child. King's voice cut through the laughter like thunder across the plains. $1. The yard fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Sheriff Harlan's eyebrows rose as he looked at King, while Thompson made a choking sound beside him. $1, King repeated, his voice carrying authority that no one dared challenge. Sheriff Harlan waited, his gavel raised. $1 bid. Going once, going twice. He paused, scanning the suddenly quiet crowd. Sold to King McAllister. The gavel's crack echoed through the yard. Murmurs erupted immediately, spreading like wildfire through the assembled townsfolk. King strode forward, his boots heavy on the wooden steps as he approached the platform. Sheriff Harlan handed him the bill of sale, then turned to help Mara down the steps. But she moved on her own, her steps careful but determined as she made her way to King's side. Once they were face to face, Mara lifted her chin and spoke in a voice low enough that only King could hear, but steady as steel. "This child I carry is James Hanley's legitimate heir. The Riverbend property, 300 acres of prime water rights, was signed over to any child of his blood. The deed is filed with the territorial office in Helena." King's expression didn't change, but his dark eyes sharpened with interest. The Riverbend property had been a point of contention for years, its water rights crucial for any rancher hoping to expand their operation. He'd been watching that land, knowing its value would only increase as more settlers moved into the territory. His initial impulse to prevent her humiliation had just transformed into something far more significant. This wasn't just about pity, or even basic human decency. though those had played their part. This woman and her unborn child held the key to one of the most valuable pieces of property in the territory. The crowd began to disperse, disappointed that their entertainment had been cut short by King's intervention. Some cast curious glances their way, wondering what words were being exchanged between the fearsome rancher and his newly acquired property. "Mr. McAllister," Mara continued, her voice still quiet but clear, "I know your reputation. You're known for being ruthless in business matters. But I want you to understand, this child's claim is legally binding. The property can't be sold or transferred until they come of age." King studied her face, noting the intelligence in her eyes and the careful way she presented this information, not as a threat, but as a simple statement of fact. This woman was no simple widow to be pitied. She was a mother protecting her child's future with the only weapons she had, the law and the truth. Sheriff Harlan approached them, his expression concerned. "Everything in order, McAllister?" "It is," King replied, his deep voice betraying nothing of his thoughts. "The lady will be coming with me." He turned to Mara. "My wagon's this way. Can you manage the steps?" Mara nodded, gathering her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. As they walked away from the auction platform, the winter sun cast long shadows across the yard, and the wind continued to whip dust and snow around them. But now there was a tension in the air that had nothing to do with the cold. It was the tension of destinies shifting, of plans being rewritten, of futures suddenly uncertain. The crowd watched as King McAllister led his purchase toward his waiting wagon, but none could hear Mara's final quiet words to him. "I trust you'll find this investment worth far more than $1 silver, Mr. McAllister." And King, master of calculating value and seeing opportunity, already knew she was right. What had started as a moment of perhaps unexpected conscience had turned into something far more complex. The woman walking beside him carried not just a child, but the key to expanding his empire. The question now was how this unexpected situation would play out, with a woman who clearly had her own strength and agenda, and a child whose birth would shift the balance of power in the territory. The crowd parted as King McAllister led Mara through the auction yard, their stares following the unlikely pair. King's towering presence served as a shield against the whispers and pointed fingers, his broad shoulders blocking the worst of the biting wind. Fresh snow crunched beneath their boots as they approached his wagon, the sound sharp in the winter air. King turned to Mara, his hands ready to assist. "Steps high," he warned, his voice gruff but not unkind. Mara gathered her skirts with one hand, the other accepting his steadying grip. Despite her condition, she managed the climb with grace, settling onto the wooden seat. King tucked a heavy wool blanket around her before climbing up himself and taking the reins. The wagon creaked as they left town behind, the horses' hooves marking a steady rhythm in the snow. Fields stretched white and empty on either side, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the untouched drifts. After several minutes of silence, Mara spoke. "My husband's people, the Hanleys, they were stubborn folk, too proud to file their claim in court, saying the land was theirs by right of working it." She paused, her hands resting protectively over her belly. "They were wrong, of course. Pride doesn't stand up in territorial court." King kept his eyes on the road but listened intently. "The river tracks prime land. 300 acres, with half a mile of river frontage." Mara's voice grew stronger. "James knew better than his family. Before he died, he made sure any child of his would have proper legal standing." The wagon hit a rut, and King steadied the reins. "You'll need shelter, at least until the birth." "And after?" Mara turned to face him directly. "What then, Mr. McAllister?" King met her gaze. "That depends." "No," Mara said firmly. "It doesn't depend on anything. I need your word, your sworn oath, that you'll protect this child's rights to their inheritance. No schemes, no legal tricks, no pressure to sell when they come of age." The wagon crested a hill, revealing the sprawling McAllister ranch below. King remained silent for several long moments, weighing her words. Finally he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of formal declaration. I swear on my mother's grave and my Christian faith, I'll protect your child's rightful inheritance as if it were my own blood's claim." Mara studied his face, searching for any sign of deception. Finding none, she nodded once, satisfied. The sun was setting as they approached the ranch house, a large two-story structure built of solid timber. Warm lamplight spilled from the windows, and smoke curled from the chimney into the darkening sky. A woman's silhouette appeared in the doorway. Clara McAllister, King's widowed sister, drawn by the sound of the approaching wagon. King helped Mara down, keeping a steady hand under her elbow as they walked to the house. Clara stood in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral as she took in the scene before her. "Clara," King said, "this is Mara Hanley. She'll be staying with us for a time." Clara's eyes flickered to Mara's condition, then back to her brother's face. "I'll heat up some stew," she said finally, stepping aside to let them enter. The house was warm and smelled of wood smoke and cooking. Clara led Mara to the kitchen, where a pot of stew simmered on the large cast-iron stove. She filled a bowl and set it before Mara, along with a chunk of fresh bread. "There's a small room upstairs," Clara said, watching as Mara warmed her hands against the bowl. "It's plain but clean. You'll have your privacy there." "Thank you," Mara replied quietly, meeting the older woman's assessing gaze with dignity. Clara moved about the kitchen with efficient grace, her actions speaking of years of managing the household. She studied Mara when she thought the younger woman wasn't looking, noting her straight spine and careful manners. After the meal, Clara showed Mara to her room, a modest space with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small window overlooking the ranch yard. The sheets were fresh, and a quilted coverlet provided extra warmth. Downstairs in his study, King unrolled a large map across his desk. His finger traced the blue line of the river, stopping at the bend where the Hanley track lay. The location was crucial. Controlling those water rights would give him leverage over the neighboring ranches that had been squeezing his grazing rights. He sat back in his chair, the lamplight casting shadows across his weathered face. The unexpected turn of events at the auction had handed him an opportunity he hadn't anticipated. But with it came responsibility, a sworn oath he had no intention of breaking. Meanwhile, in her upstairs room, Mara knelt beside her bed. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of settling timber. She clasped her hands together, closing her eyes in prayer. "Lord," she whispered, "give me strength in this strange place. Protect this child, guide my steps, and help me trust that you have led me here for a purpose." She touched her mother's cross, hanging from a worn leather cord around her neck, drawing comfort from its familiar shape. The moon rose over the ranch, casting silver light across the snow-covered yard. In their separate spaces, both Mara and King remained awake, each contemplating the unexpected turn their lives had taken and wondering what the coming days would bring. Morning frost painted delicate patterns across the kitchen windows of the McAllister ranch house. Clara moved with practiced efficiency, setting out coffee cups and plates while keeping one eye on her brother. King sat at the heavy oak table, reviewing papers with his usual intensity. "You know what people will say," Clara said, pouring steaming coffee into his cup. Her voice was low, mindful of the guests sleeping upstairs. "Harboring a pregnant widow, a half-Indian one at that. The gossips in town will have a field day." King looked up from his papers, his expression unchanged. "Since when have I cared what people say?" "Since never," Clara admitted, settling into the chair across from him. "But this is different. The Hanleys won't take kindly to you sheltering their dead son's wife." Before King could respond, boots scraped on the porch outside. A sharp knock followed, echoing through the quiet house. King rose, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. A ranch hand stood in the doorway, his horse still breathing hard in the yard behind him. "Mr. McAllister?" he said, removing his hat. "News from town. The Hanleys' lawyer filed papers first thing this morning. They're claiming the river track by family arrangement, saying it was always meant to stay with their bloodline." King's jaw tightened. "Saddle my horse," he ordered, "and have the wagon ready for Miss Hanley." Within the hour, Mara descended the stairs wrapped in a shawl Clara had lent her. King helped her into the wagon, and they set out for town, frost crunching under the wheels. The territorial clerk's office occupied a cramped room above the general store. Inside, the clerk, a thin man named Peterson, laid out their options with apologetic gestures. "The Hanleys have a strong claim through family connection," Peterson explained. "Without a direct legal tie, Miss Hanley's position is precarious." From his position by the window, Hanley's lawyer smirked, clearly confident in his client's case. "What about a spousal claim?" King asked, his voice cutting through the musty air. Peterson brightened. "Ah, yes, a marriage would establish immediate legal standing. The territorial code is quite clear on spousal property rights." Mara stiffened beside King. "No," she said firmly. "I won't be forced into marriage again, not even to protect what's rightfully my child's." The lawyer's smirk widened, and something in his smug expression seemed to spark a change in Mara. She turned to King, her eyes fierce. "Unless," she said slowly, "it's done properly. In church before witnesses, a public declaration that can't be questioned or twisted later." King met her gaze steadily. "Reverend Haskins is usually at the church this time of day." The small clapboard church stood at the edge of town, its white paint peeling in the winter wind. Inside, Reverend Haskins listened to their situation with gentle attention, his weathered face showing no judgment. "Marriage is a sacred covenant," he said carefully, "not to be entered into lightly." "There's nothing light about this," Mara responded. "It's about justice and keeping promises to the dead." The Reverend nodded slowly. "Then let me ring the church bell. A proper wedding should have witnesses." The bell's clear tones drew curious townspeople from their midday routines. They filled the pews, whispering among themselves as King and Mara stood before the altar. Clara arrived, slightly out of breath, to stand beside her brother. Reverend Haskins opened his Bible, his voice carrying to the rafters. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." The ceremony was brief but proper. King's "I do" rang out strong and clear. Mara's response was quieter but no less firm. When they exchanged rings, simple bands hastily purchased from the general store, their hands were steady. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Haskins declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." As they stepped out of the church, the first snowflakes began to fall. They drifted down silently, adding a strange beauty to the stark winter day. King helped Mara into the wagon, acutely aware that they were now legally bound, two strangers joined by necessity, law, and the pride that had brought them to this moment. The townsfolk watched them drive away, the snow beginning to coat their shoulders and hats. In the wagon, King and Mara sat in silence, each contemplating the unexpected turn their lives had taken. The fresh snow erased their tracks as they headed back to the ranch, where they would have to learn what it meant to be husband and wife in name, if not in heart. Clara rode beside them on her own horse, her expression thoughtful as she watched her brother and his new bride. The snow fell steadily now, wrapping the world in white, as if nature itself was trying to soften the edges of this sharp-edged arrangement. The journey back to the McAllister Ranch was slow and silent, with fresh snow settling thick on the wagon's canvas cover. King handled the reins with practiced ease, guiding the horses through the deepening white drifts. Beside him, Mara sat wrapped in an extra blanket Clara had thoughtfully brought to the church, her wedding ring catching occasional glints of the pale winter sun. When they finally reached the ranch house, Clara immediately took charge. "A proper wedding deserves a proper supper," she announced, heading straight for the kitchen, "even if it is unexpected." Mara followed her, unwrapping her shawl. "Let me help," she offered, rolling up her sleeves. "It's the least I can do." Clara watched with careful eyes as Mara moved around the kitchen with quiet confidence, measuring flour for bread without being asked. "You've worked in a kitchen before," she observed. "My grandmother taught me," Mara replied, her hands working the dough with practiced movements. "She always said a woman should know how to feed her family, whether in a lodge or a house." As the afternoon wore on, savory aromas filled the house. Mara proved her worth with a venison stew that even Clara had to admit was perfectly seasoned. The bread came out golden and crusty, filling the kitchen with its homey scent. The wedding supper was served at the big oak table, with Clara's best tablecloth and the good dishes she usually saved for holidays. King sat at the head of the table, Mara to his right, while Clara took her usual place opposite. The meal passed quietly, broken only by requests to pass dishes and polite compliments on the food. After the dishes were cleared, King retreated to his study as was his habit. Through the closed door, they could hear him moving papers and opening map cases. Mara settled at the kitchen table with paper and pen borrowed from Clara, beginning a letter to her grandmother at the Cheyenne agency. "Dear grandmother," she wrote, her pen scratching softly. "Much has changed since I last wrote. I am married again, though not as anyone might have expected." Days began to settle into a pattern at the McAllister Ranch. Mornings brought the scent of coffee and the quiet sounds of breakfast being prepared. Mara rose early, helping Clara with the morning routine. King would come down from his room, eat quickly, and head out to check on the cattle in the bitter cold. During the days, Mara kept herself busy. She found a basket of shirts needing mending and set to work with needle and thread, her neat stitches drawing approving glances from Clara. The widow's sharp tongue seemed to soften slightly when she saw how Mara worked without complaint, taking on whatever tasks needed doing. One crisp morning, King walked into the barn to find Mara standing in the stall of a notoriously difficult mare. The horse, known for her skittish nature, was letting Mara stroke her nose while murmuring soft words in a mix of English and Cheyenne. Old Amos, the ranch's wrangler, stood watching with his arms crossed. "Been trying to gentle that one for weeks," he said to King, shaking his head in wonder. "Your wife's got away with her." King observed the scene silently. The mare's usual nervous dancing had stilled under Mara's touch, her ears forward and relaxed. When Mara stepped back from the stall, the horse nickered softly after her. "My grandmother raised horses," Mara explained, seeing their looks. "She taught me their ways before she taught me anything else." Amos nodded with gruff approval. "Reckon she taught you right, ma'am." That evening, Clara noticed a subtle shift during supper. The usual silence was broken when King asked Mara about her grandmother's horse training methods. Mara's response was measured but clear, describing techniques passed down through generations. "Makes sense," King said, nodding thoughtfully. "Might be worth trying with some of our younger stock." The conversation continued naturally, touching on ranch matters and horse behavior. Clara watched as the rigid formality between them seemed to ease slightly, like ice beginning to thaw at the edges. It wasn't warmth yet, but it was a change from the frozen silence of their first days as husband and wife. After supper, instead of immediately retreating to his study, King lingered at the table while Mara described a method for calming colts during their first saddling. His questions were practical, focused on the details, but he listened with genuine interest. Clara busied herself with the dishes, hiding a small smile as she observed this first real conversation between her brother and his new wife. The evening ended as others had, with King in his study and Mara in her upstairs room, but something had shifted. The ranch hands had begun touching their hats respectfully when Mara passed. Clara found herself consulting Mara about household decisions. And King, though still reserved, had begun to look at his new wife with something that resembled respect. In the barn, the difficult mare now whinnied hopefully whenever Mara appeared, a small but telling sign that things were changing at the McAllister Ranch, as quietly and steadily as the winter snow piled up outside. A week of relative peace at the McAllister Ranch ended when supplies ran low. King had ridden out at dawn to check the frozen stock ponds, leaving Clara and Mara to handle the necessary trip into town. The winter morning was crisp and clear as they loaded the wagon, their breath forming white clouds in the cold air. "We should be quick about it," Clara said, settling the buffalo robe over their laps. "Storm's coming by nightfall if my aching joints are any sign." Mara nodded, gripping the seat as the wagon lurched forward. The road into town was rutted with frozen wheel tracks, making for a bumpy ride. Both women stayed quiet, lost in their own thoughts until the first buildings came into view. The mercantile's bell jingled as they entered. Mr. Peterson, the shopkeeper, was helping Margaret Hanley, the Hanley matriarch, who stood examining fabric at the counter. The elegant woman's spine stiffened at their entrance, though she didn't turn around. "Good morning, Mrs. McAllister," Peterson called out nervously, his eyes darting between the two women. "And Mrs. McAllister," he added, addressing Mara with obvious discomfort. Clara strode forward with her list, but Mara hung back, moving toward the shelf of dry goods they needed. She could feel Mrs. Hanley's cold gaze following her movements. "I wasn't aware the mercantile had become so inclusive in its clientele," Mrs. Hanley's voice carried clearly through the store. "One never knows what sort of people one might encounter these days." Mara's hands remained steady as she selected coffee and sugar, though her cheeks burned. She heard Clara's sharp intake of breath. "Perhaps some establishments should maintain higher standards," Mrs. Hanley continued, her silk skirts rustling as she turned to face Mara directly. "After all, we wouldn't want to encourage those who acquire their position through questionable means." "My money spends as well as anyone's, Mrs. Hanley," Mara said quietly, meeting the woman's eyes. "And my marriage is legal under territorial law." Mrs. Hanley's lips curved in a cruel smile. "Laws can be changed, my dear, as can marriages, especially those made in haste." Clara stepped between them, her voice like steel. "Our purchases, Mr. Peterson. Now, if you please." Other customers had filtered in, creating an audience for the tension. Whispers followed Mara as she helped Clara gather their supplies. Half-breed fortune hunter and McAllister's shame reached her ears, but she kept her chin high, movements deliberate and dignified. The wagon seemed a sanctuary when they finally loaded it. Clara clucked to the horses, eager to leave town behind. They were halfway home when Mara spotted movement on the ridge above the road. "Clara," she said softly, nodding toward the silhouettes of mounted men following their progress. "Hanley riders?" Clara confirmed grimly, urging the horses faster. "They've been getting bold lately, testing boundaries." The riders kept pace with them all the way to the McAllister property line, where they finally turned away. By then, Clara's knuckles were white on the reins, and Mara's heart was pounding despite her outward calm. King returned as twilight was gathering, bringing the promised storm with him. He found them in the kitchen, where Clara was relating the day's events in clipped tones. His jaw tightened as he listened, especially at the mention of the Hanley riders. "They had no business on that ridge," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "and less business harassing my wife in town." Mara looked up sharply at the possessive word, but King was already striding toward his study. They heard him cleaning his rifle that night, the sharp smell of gun oil drifting under his door. The next morning, King rode out early, his face set in hard lines. Clara and Mara exchanged worried glances over breakfast, but neither spoke their concerns aloud. The morning crawled by with agonizing slowness until hoofbeats announced his return. King came in stamping snow from his boots. "Had a talk with the Hanleys," he announced, accepting the coffee Mara offered. "Made it clear that following my wagon or harassing my family will have consequences." "Was there trouble?" Clara asked, studying her brother's face. "No shots fired," King replied grimly, "but they understand now. Their riders stay off our range, or there will be—" That evening, after Clara had gone up to bed, Mara found King still sitting at the kitchen table. She poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him, sliding one his way. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for today." King wrapped his hands around the warm cup. The Hanleys have always been bullies, using their money and connections to push folks around. He took a slow sip. "Never could stomach bullies." "Nor I," Mara agreed. "My grandmother used to say that those who abuse power reveal their own weakness." "Wise woman, your grandmother!" King studied her over his cup. "You handled yourself well in town today. Kept your dignity while they showed their lack of it." "I've had practice," Mara admitted. "Being caught between two worlds teaches you to stand your ground, or you'll never stop running." They sat in companionable silence, drinking their coffee as the winter wind howled outside. The kitchen was warm, and for the first time, the quiet between them felt restful rather than strained. When King finally rose to bank the fire for the night, he paused at the bottom of the stairs. "The Hanleys won't trouble you again," he said firmly. "You have my word on that." Mara nodded, understanding that his promise meant more than just protection. It was recognition that she belonged here now, under his roof and his name, regardless of what anyone in town might say. "Thank you," she said again, and this time they both knew she meant more than just the day's intervention. The lamp cast their shadows on the wall as they climbed the stairs to their separate rooms. Two people brought together by necessity, but finding perhaps something more solid growing between them than mere convenience or law. The morning dawned bitter cold, frost painting delicate patterns across the window panes. Mara stood at the kitchen stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal while Clara kneaded bread dough nearby. King had already eaten and gone out to check the cattle, leaving the two women to their morning routine. A sharp knock at the door startled them both. Through the window, they could see an elderly man on horseback, his black coat dusted with snow and a worn leather satchel hanging from his shoulder. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door. "Reverend Lowry, what brings you out in this weather?" The circuit preacher's weathered face crinkled into a smile as he stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. "The Lord's work knows no season, Mrs. McAllister." His eyes found Mara, and something flickered across his expression. "And I have business that couldn't wait." Clara quickly set about making tea while Mara helped the Reverend out of his coat. His hands trembled slightly from the cold as he settled at the kitchen table, placing his satchel carefully beside him. "I've been making my rounds," Reverend Lowry explained, accepting a steaming cup from Clara. "Carrying letters and news between settlements. Some matters require personal attention." The way his eyes kept drifting to Mara made her stomach tighten. She sat down across from him, her own tea untouched. "I carry more than just the good book in my travels," he continued, patting his satchel. "People trust me with their correspondence, their legal papers. Sometimes," he hesitated, "their secrets." The Reverend reached into his satchel and withdrew a letter, its paper yellowed and creased from frequent folding. "This came into my possession recently. Given the current situation with your land claim, Mrs. McAllister, I felt obligated to bring it forward." Mara's hands shook slightly as she took the letter. The handwriting was familiar, her late husband's uneven scrawl. As she read, the blood drained from her face. "What is it?" Clara asked, concern evident in her voice. "A letter," Mara whispered, "from my husband to the Hanleys. He offered them our land claim in exchange for forgiving his gambling debts." Clara inhaled sharply. "When was this written?" 3 months before his death," Reverend Lowry answered. "It never reached the Hanleys. He gave it to me for safekeeping, then died before deciding whether to send it." The kitchen door opened, bringing a blast of cold air as King entered. He took in the scene quickly. The Reverend's presence, Mara's pale face, the letter in her trembling hands. "Reverend," he said carefully, removing his gloves, "what brings you to my home?" The elderly man explained again about the letter, while King read it himself, his expression growing darker with each line. "This was never notarized," King observed, studying the paper closely. "No," Reverend Lowry agreed. "It's not legally binding, but in a territorial court, where judges often rule on character and intention." He left the implication hanging. King's jaw tightened. "You're saying this could sway opinion against Mara's claim?" "The Hanleys would certainly use it to paint a different picture of the situation." The Reverend sipped his tea. "They could argue the land was promised to them before your marriage." Mara pushed back from the table, needing space to breathe. The walls of security she'd begun to build around herself seemed to be crumbling. "A promise made under duress, by a man deep in debt," King countered. "That hardly constitutes a legitimate agreement." "Perhaps not," Reverend Lowry conceded. "But these matters are rarely simple. I felt you both should know what might come to light." A heavy silence fell over the kitchen. Outside, snow began falling again, thick flakes swirling past the windows. "The storm's getting worse," Clara observed. "Reverend, you'd best stay the night. We can make up a bed in the bunkhouse." The old man nodded gratefully. "Thank you. These bones aren't as hardy as they used to be." King helped Clara settle the Reverend in the bunkhouse while Mara retreated to the parlor. She stood at the window, watching the snow build up in drifts, her mind churning with doubt and fear. Later that evening, after Clara had gone up to bed, King found Mara still at the window. He stood beside her, both of them watching the storm rage outside. "That letter doesn't change anything," he said finally. "Your claim is still legitimate." "Is it?" Mara turned to face him. "My husband was willing to trade away our land, our child's inheritance, for gambling debts. What does that say about our right to it?" "It says he was a desperate man making desperate choices." King's voice was firm. "But his actions don't erase your rights or your child's." "The Hanleys won't see it that way." "The Hanleys will use anything they can to discredit your claim," King acknowledged. "But we knew that already. This letter, it's just one more weapon in their arsenal, nothing more." Mara wrapped her arms around herself, trying to draw strength from his certainty. But doubt had taken root, a persistent whisper in the back of her mind. What other secrets might surface? What other challenges to her child's future might emerge from the past? King seemed to sense her turmoil. "We'll face whatever comes," he said quietly. "The law is still on our side, and so am I." She nodded, grateful for his support even as uncertainty gnawed at her. The snow continued to fall outside, building walls of white around the ranch house, while inside, Mara wrestled with the ghost of her husband's choices and their power to threaten everything she was fighting to protect. The days following Reverend Lowry's revelation settled into a tense rhythm at the McAllister Ranch. The letter's shadow hung over the household like the heavy winter clouds that blanketed the valley. But rather than surrender to worry, Mara threw herself into work with fierce determination. Each morning before dawn, she could be found in the kitchen, stoking the cook stove and preparing hearty breakfast for the ranch hands. The men, initially wary of their boss's new wife, began nodding respectfully as she served up steaming plates of flapjacks and bacon. Her bread, seasoned with herbs from her grandmother's teachings, earned particular praise. "Never had biscuits quite like these," old Amos commented one morning, reaching for seconds. "Got some magic in them, I reckon." In the afternoons, Mara settled in the tack room, her skilled fingers mending worn leather and replacing broken stitching. The familiar work soothed her, reminding her of peaceful days learning these skills from her mother. Sometimes Clara would join her, the two women working in companionable silence. The evenings brought a different kind of peace. After supper, Mara would read aloud from the family Bible while Clara mended clothes by lamplight. Her clear voice filled the parlor with ancient words of hope and perseverance, seeming to push back the darkness that gathered outside the windows. King spent these days largely confined to his study, emerging only for meals and brief conversations with his foreman. Through the door, Mara could hear him pacing, the scratch of his pen, and occasional muttered curses. Stacks of legal papers and territorial maps covered his desk as he worked to build their case. One particularly cold afternoon, as Mara kneaded dough in the kitchen, the sound of hoofbeats drew her to the window. A single rider approached through the swirling snow, his dark coat and straight-backed posture marking him as no ordinary traveler. Clara opened the door to find a dignified elderly man with silver-streaked hair and keen dark eyes. "I am Samuel Greyhawk," he announced simply. "I've come to speak with King McAllister and his wife." Mara recognized the name. A respected Crow elder, known for his work in land disputes between settlers and native peoples. Her heart quickened as Clara showed him into the kitchen. "Word travels even in winter," Greyhawk said, accepting a cup of coffee from Clara. "I heard of your situation, Mrs. McAllister, and the challenge to your claim." King emerged from his study at the sound of voices. His eyebrows rose slightly at the sight of their unexpected visitor, but he extended his hand in greeting. "Samuel Greyhawk, your reputation precedes you." "As does yours, Mr. McAllister." Greyhawk's smile held a hint of irony, though perhaps not always in the same way. Mara served a simple meal of venison stew and fresh bread while Greyhawk spoke. He had been a witness to many treaty signings, he explained, and kept careful records of land agreements between tribes and settlers. "The river tract you claim," he said, pulling worn documents from his coat, "has an interesting history, one that precedes any settler's filing by many years." King leaned forward, his attention sharp. "Go on." Greyhawk spread a yellowed map across the table, its edges cracked with age. "This treaty, signed 40 years ago, explicitly recognized Cheyenne rights to the river bend. It was never properly recorded in territorial books. Convenient for some, perhaps. But the document exists, and I can testify to its authenticity." Mara's hand went instinctively to her growing belly. "My grandmother spoke of such agreements, but I never saw proof." "Your grandmother was wise to remember," Greyhawk nodded. "Memory is powerful, but paper speaks louder in white men's courts." He gave King a measured look. "No offense intended." "None taken," King replied, studying the map intently. "This could change everything. The Hanleys' claim rests entirely on recent territorial filings. If there's a prior treaty right, then your wife's child, through their Cheyenne blood, has the strongest claim of all," Greyhawk finished. "The letter your reverend friend discovered might muddy the waters, but it cannot override treaty rights." Clara, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "Will you testify to this in court, Mr. Greyhawk?" "That is why I came." He turned to Mara. "Your situation touches on larger issues than just one piece of land. How this case is decided could affect many similar claims. I believe justice must be served for all our peoples." King's expression was thoughtful as he traced the river's path on the old map. "The territorial judge won't like it. This could set a precedent that threatens a lot of powerful interests." "Good," Mara said firmly, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "Let them be threatened. Let them know they cannot simply take what they want anymore." Greyhawk's eyes crinkled with approval. "You have your grandmother's spirit, young woman. She would be proud." The elder stayed through the afternoon, sharing his deep knowledge of treaties and land laws. King took careful notes, his legal strategy shifting and strengthening with each new piece of information. Mara listened intently, her hope growing as Greyhawk detailed how other similar cases had been won. As the winter sun began to set, Greyhawk rose to leave despite Clara's protests that he should stay the night. "I have other visits to make," he explained, wrapping his coat tight against the cold. "But I will return when you need me to speak before the judge." At the door, he paused and turned to Mara. "Remember, the land knows its true people. Hold to that truth, and justice will follow." They watched him ride away through the gathering dusk, his figure growing smaller until it disappeared into the swirling snow. The kitchen felt warmer somehow, as if his presence had kindled fresh hope in all of them. King gathered the documents Greyhawk had left, handling them with new respect. "This changes everything," he said quietly. "With the treaty evidence and his testimony, we have a real chance of defeating the Hanleys' challenge." Mara touched the old map gently, feeling the weight of history in its worn surface. Her child would have a birthright after all, one that reached back far beyond any recent claims or broken promises. For the first time since Reverend Lowry's visit, she felt truly certain of her path forward. 3 days after Samuel Greyhawk's visit, the snow clouds finally broke. Pale winter sunlight sparkled on the drifts as King's wagon rolled out of the ranch yard, loaded with supplies for the 2-day journey to the county seat. Mara sat between King and Greyhawk on the front bench, wrapped in thick blankets against the biting cold. Clara stood in the doorway watching them leave. "Godspeed," she called out, her breath visible in the frigid air. "Mind you don't freeze on that way station stop." The wagon wheels creaked over the packed snow as they followed the valley road east. King handled the reins with practiced ease, keeping the horses at a steady pace. Mara could feel the solid warmth of his shoulder against hers, a quiet comfort in the bitter morning. "The weather should hold," Greyhawk observed, studying the pale blue sky, "though the nights will be cold." They traveled in companionable silence through the morning, passing snow-covered pastures and skeletal cottonwoods. Around midday, they stopped in a sheltered grove to rest the horses and share a simple meal of bread, dried beef, and hot coffee from a thermos. While King tended to the team, checking their hooves for ice buildup and adjusting their blankets, Mara and Greyhawk walked a short distance from the wagon. Their boots crunched in the snow as the elder spoke quietly of the old days, of treaties made and broken, of the importance of remembering. "Your grandmother was right to teach you the old ways," he said, his dark eyes distant with memory. "But she was also wise to send you to the mission school. We must walk in both worlds now." Mara nodded, one hand resting on her swollen belly. "I want my child to know both sides of their heritage, to be proud of all their ancestors." "That pride will give them strength," Greyhawk agreed, "just as it gives you strength now." They continued eastward through the afternoon, the horses' breath steaming in the cold air. As the sun began to set, they reached the way station, a rough log building that served as an overnight stop for travelers. The station keeper, a gruff man named Peterson, showed them to the common room where a few other travelers huddled near the fireplace. The night was indeed cold, with wind whistling through the building's many cracks. Mara lay wrapped in her blankets on a narrow cot, listening to the popping of the fire and the soft snores of other travelers. Across the room, King sat propped against the wall, his buffalo coat drawn tight, keeping watch as he dozed. Dawn brought another clear day, and they set out early. The second day's travel seemed shorter somehow, filled with Greyhawk's stories of the land they passed through. Tales of battles and peace councils, of buffalo hunts and vision quests. King listened intently, asking occasional questions that showed his growing understanding of the territory's complex history. By late afternoon, they reached the county seat, a growing town of brick buildings and wooden sidewalks. King guided the wagon to the livery stable, then helped Mara down with gentle hands. She straightened her skirts and lifted her chin, ready to face whatever came next. The courthouse dominated the town square, its red brick walls rising 2 stories high. Inside, the air smelled of wood polish and tobacco. Their boots echoed on the wooden floors as they climbed the stairs to Judge Avery's chambers. The judge was a lean man with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He looked up from his desk as they entered, his gaze taking in King's imposing presence, Mara's quiet dignity, and Greyhawk's ceremonial vest. "McAllister," he nodded. "I heard you'd married, and Samuel Greyhawk, it's been some years." "Too many, Joseph," Greyhawk replied easily. "We bring something that needs your attention." King stepped forward, laying the treaty documents carefully on the judge's desk. "Evidence regarding the river tract claim, Your Honor. Documents that predate all current filings." Judge Avery adjusted his spectacles and began reading, his expression growing more serious with each page. The room was silent, except for the ticking of a wall clock and the rustle of paper. Finally, he looked up. "This is quite something, a properly witnessed treaty with clear boundaries marked, and you can testify to its authenticity, Samuel." "I was there when it was signed," Greyhawk confirmed. "I can name every chief and agent who put their mark on that paper." The judge leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "You understand the Hanleys won't take this lying down. They've got friends in the territorial legislature, connections in Washington." "We understand," Mara spoke up, her voice steady. "But this is about more than just one piece of land. It's about honoring promises made, about justice for all who live here." Judge Avery studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll review these documents thoroughly. There will need to be a formal hearing with all parties present. The Hanleys' lawyers will fight tooth and nail." "Let them," King said quietly. "We have truth on our side." They left the courthouse as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the snow-covered square. The journey home would have to wait until morning. King had arranged rooms at the hotel for the night. The return trip the next day seemed easier somehow, as if a weight had been lifted. Though the air was still bitterly cold, there was a sense of accomplishment, of progress made. When they stopped to rest the horses at midday, Mara found herself sharing King's blanket as they sat on the wagon seat, their shoulders touching. "Thank you," she said softly, "for standing with me in this." King's eyes met hers, warm despite the winter chill. "I gave my word," he replied simply, but there was something more in his voice, something beyond mere duty or obligation. The rest of the journey passed in comfortable quiet, broken only by Greyhawk's occasional comments about the land they passed through. The three travelers shared the blankets and hot coffee, bound together now by more than just a legal case. As the wagon rolled homeward through the gathering dusk, Mara felt a new warmth that had nothing to do with wool blankets or steaming drinks. The March sun worked steadily at winter's grip, turning snowdrifts to muddy rivulets that carved paths down the streets. Inside the courthouse, bodies packed the wooden benches shoulder to shoulder, their winter coats and shawls adding to the stuffy warmth. Mara sat straight-backed beside King in the front row, her hands folded over her expanding belly. Judge Avery's gavel cracked against the desk. "We're here for final testimony in the matter of the river track claim," he announced, his voice carrying to the far corners of the room. "Samuel Greyhawk will speak to the historical record." Greyhawk rose slowly from his seat, his ceremonial vest bright against the dark wool of his suit. He moved to the front with measured steps, each boot placement deliberate as he faced the crowded room. The usual courthouse whispers fell silent. "I stand before you as one who remembers," he began, his deep voice resonant with dignity. "I was there when the first treaty was signed, when promises were made between peoples. The river tract you speak of was marked clearly in those days, from the lightning-struck cottonwood to the three-peaked hill." The Hanleys' lawyer, a sharp-featured man named Bradford, shifted impatiently in his chair. His pen scratched against paper as he made notes, his mouth twisted in a dismissive smile. Greyhawk continued, unruffled. "The boundaries were walked by chiefs and agents together. Every stream, every ridge was noted. The document before you bears the marks of those who pledged their honor, both native and white." He gestured to the treaty papers on the judge's desk. "I witnessed those marks being made. I can speak to the truth of every line." Bradford stood, adjusting his vest. "And we're to take the word of a—" He paused meaningfully. "Local resident over properly filed homestead claims?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. King's hand tightened on the bench beside Mara's skirts. Judge Avery's gavel cracked again. "Mr. Bradford, you will show respect to all witnesses in this court." Greyhawk met Bradford's eyes steadily. "I speak truth here, as I was taught. Each word carries the weight of my people's honor. Can you say the same?" The questioning continued for over an hour. Bradford tried repeatedly to discredit the treaty's authenticity, but Greyhawk's testimony remained unshakable. He named every person present at the signing, described the weather that day, even recalled the particular shade of ink used. Finally, Judge Avery held up his hand. "I've heard enough." He shuffled through the papers before him, then looked up at the packed room. "The evidence is clear. The river tract claim predates all subsequent filings. By law and by right, ownership falls to Mrs. McAllister as heir to the original treaty holders." His gavel fell with finality. "This case is closed." Relief swept through Mara like a warm Chinook wind. She felt King's arm brush against hers as he stood, his presence solid and reassuring. Around them, the courtroom erupted in motion and voices, some celebrating, others grumbling in disappointment. Bradford gathered his papers with sharp movements, his face flushed. The Hanley matriarch swept past them without a glance, her skirts rustling with disapproval. But Greyhawk's smile was bright as he shook King's hand, then gently squeezed Mara's shoulder. That evening, lanterns glowed from the windows of the church hall. The spring social was a tradition in the town, marking winter's end with music and fellowship. Mara hadn't planned to attend, but Clara insisted, helping her dress in a blue calico that somehow still fit over her growing belly. The hall hummed with conversation and the tuning of fiddles. Women had brought pies and cakes, their sweet scents mixing with coffee and wood smoke. Mara found a seat near the wall, watching couples gather for the first dance. King appeared beside her chair, looking somewhat uncomfortable in his good suit. He cleared his throat. "Would you care to dance?" Mara looked up at him surprised. "I didn't know you danced." A slight smile touched his lips. "Not well, but I can manage a waltz without stepping on too many toes." She took his offered hand, letting him lead her onto the floor. His other hand settled carefully at her waist as the music began. Their first steps were hesitant, slightly out of sync, but gradually they found their rhythm together. "Thank you," Mara said softly as they turned, "for everything you've done." King's hand tightened slightly on hers. "You won that case yourself, you and Greyhawk." "But you gave me the chance when no one else would." The fiddles soared into a sweeter melody. Around them, other couples swirled and laughed, but Mara was aware only of King's steady presence, the warmth of his hand, the way his eyes held hers with newfound softness. They danced 3 more times that evening. With each dance, their movements grew more natural, more harmonious. During a lively reel, Mara caught sight of Clara watching them, a knowing smile on her face. The night air was mild when they finally left the hall, hinting at spring's approach. Stars sparkled above the quiet town, and somewhere in the distance, meadowlarks called their evening songs. As King helped Mara into the wagon, their hands lingered together a moment longer than necessary. The ride home was peaceful, filled with comfortable silence and shared warmth. Both felt the shift in their relationship, the marriage of necessity beginning to bloom into something deeper, something chosen rather than imposed. Spring brought a gentler rhythm to the McAllister Ranch. The rising sun found King and Mara sharing coffee in the kitchen each morning, steam rising from their cups as they discussed the day ahead. The harsh edges of their arranged marriage had begun to soften, like snow melting into spring earth. Over breakfast, they planned the spring planting together. Mara's knowledge of companion crops impressed King. She explained how corn, beans, and squash could grow together, supporting each other just as the Cheyenne had taught for generations. He listened intently, making notes in his leather-bound ledger. Clara watched their growing ease with quiet satisfaction. At supper, conversation flowed more freely. King would share news from his cattle rounds, while Mara described improvements she wanted to make to the kitchen garden. Even the ranch hands noticed the change, commenting on how the big house felt more like a home these days. One mild evening, as darkness settled over the land, Mara stood at the kitchen window washing dishes. The spring air carried the sweet scent of new grass through the open window. King sat at the table behind her, reading through cattle contracts by lamplight. The peace shattered with a shout from outside. "Fire, the hay barn's ablaze!" King's chair scraped back as he leapt to his feet. Through the window, orange flames already licked the night sky. The dark shapes of ranch hands ran toward the burning building, their voices carrying on the wind. "Form a bucket line!" King's voice boomed across the yard as he rushed outside. "Get water from the well!" Mara grabbed her shawl and hurried out after him. The heat of the fire struck her face as she emerged from the house. Flames engulfed the upper part of the barn, dancing wickedly against the stars. The crack and roar of burning timber filled the air. Through the chaos, she heard something that made her blood run cold, the frightened bawling of a calf from inside the barn. Without thinking, Mara ran toward the building. "The Newman calf is still inside," she called out, darting past the line of men passing buckets. "Mara, no!" King's shout followed her, but she was already at the barn door. Smoke rolled out in thick waves as she entered. The heat was incredible, pressing against her like a physical force. Coughing, she pulled her shawl over her nose and mouth, scanning the hazy interior. Flames raced across the ceiling, dropping burning bits of hay like deadly rain. The calf's cry came again, weaker now from the back corner. Mara crouched low, moving as quickly as she dared. Her eyes stung from the smoke. Through the haze, she spotted the small brown form huddled against the wall, trapped behind a fallen beam. "I'm coming," she called softly, inching closer. "Stay still, little one." A thunderous crack split the air. Mara looked up to see burning rafters giving way. Flaming debris crashed down, blocking her path to the door. Terror gripped her chest as she realized she was trapped. The smoke grew thicker. Her lungs burned with every breath. She could barely see now, barely think through the roaring in her ears. The heat pressed in from all sides, unbearable. Suddenly, a large shape burst through the flames. King's voice cut through the chaos. "Mara!" His strong arms wrapped around her, lifting her off her feet. She tried to point to the calf, but could only cough violently. King seemed to understand. Still holding her with one arm, he reached down and scooped up the frightened animal. "Hold on to me," he ordered, and she clutched his shirt as he charged back through the inferno. They burst out into the cool night air. King carried them well away from the burning building before setting them down. The calf wobbled but stayed upright, bleeding pitifully. Mara doubled over coughing, her throat raw. Her eyes watered from the smoke, and her dress was singed in several places. Through the haze of tears, she saw ranch hands still fighting the fire, though it was clearly a losing battle. Then a different kind of pain seized her, sharp and low in her belly. She gasped, one hand flying to her swollen middle. "No," she whispered, "it's too soon." Another pain gripped her, stronger than the first. She swayed on her feet, and King's hand steadied her shoulders. "Mara!" His voice was thick with concern. "The baby," she managed between clenched teeth. "Something's wrong." King's face paled in the firelight. "Clara!" he shouted toward the house. "Come quick!" His sister appeared at a run, took one look at Mara's face, and took charge. "Get her inside," Clara ordered, "and send someone for the doctor, now!" King swept Mara into his arms again, this time carrying her toward the house. Each step jostled another pain through her body. She pressed her face against his chest, trying to breathe through the fear and smoke still burning in her lungs. Behind them, the hay barn collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. But King didn't look back, focused only on getting Mara to safety. As he climbed the porch steps, she caught a glimpse of riders disappearing into the darkness. The Hanley's men, no doubt, fleeing the scene of their revenge. Inside, Clara had already begun preparing the bedroom, laying out clean linens and heating water. King placed Mara gently on the bed, his usually stern face etched with worry. "The doctor's coming?" he assured her, though they both knew the town physician was a good hour's ride away. "Hold on." Another contraction seized her, and Mara gripped his hand hard. Her skin was still hot from the fire, her throat raw from smoke. Every breath brought a new cough, and every cough triggered more pain. Clara pressed a cool cloth to Mara's forehead. "We need to slow this down," she murmured. "The baby's not ready yet." But Mara's body had other plans. The contractions kept coming, stronger and closer together. She could taste smoke with every labored breath, could still feel the terror of being trapped in the burning barn. King remained by her side, his large hand engulfing hers, his presence steady even as fear threatened to overwhelm her. "Don't let them win," she whispered between pains. "Don't let them take this too." King's grip tightened on her hand. "They won't," he promised, his voice fierce with protection. "You're stronger than they know, both of you are." Through the open window came the sounds of men still fighting the fire, their shouts mixing with the crack and hiss of flames. But here in the bedroom, time seemed to slow to the rhythm of Mara's labored breathing, and the steady tick of the mantel clock as they waited for the doctor to arrive. The temperature plummeted as night deepened. Outside, fat snowflakes began drifting down from the black sky, slowly at first, then in thick curtains that obscured the smoldering remains of the hay barn. Inside the ranch house, Clara had transformed the warm kitchen into a makeshift birthing room, laying clean quilts across the long wooden table and setting water to boil on the stove. Mara's labor pains grew stronger, each wave leaving her gasping. The smoke she'd inhaled in the barn made every breath a struggle, and her coughs grew more violent. Clara wiped her brow with a cool cloth, while King paced by the window, his face carved with worry. "Travis rode out for Dr. Matthews an hour ago," Clara said, checking the window. "Should have reached town by now." But the snow fell harder, piling in deep drifts across the yard. Another hour passed, then two. No sign of Travis or the doctor. Mara's cries grew more frequent, her skin burning with fever. "Something's wrong," Clara muttered, pressing her hand to Mara's belly. "The baby's turned awkward, I think. We need the doctor." King strode to the door, shrugging on his heavy buffalo coat. "I'm going after them." "Brother, you can't," Clara started. "I made her a promise," King cut in, his voice rough with emotion. He knelt beside the table where Mara lay, taking her small hand in his. Her fingers were hot against his palm, her dark eyes glazed with pain. "I swear to God Almighty," he whispered, pressing her hand to his chest. "If you and this child live through this night, I'll be a changed man. I'll make things right, with you, with your people, with everyone I've wronged." His voice cracked. "Just hold on." Mara managed a weak nod, another contraction stealing her words. King squeezed her hand one last time before rising. Clara handed him an extra scarf. "Be careful, the temperature's still dropping." King pulled on his thick gloves and wrapped the scarf around his face, leaving only his eyes exposed. The kitchen door opened with a blast of Arctic air, and then he was gone into the whiteout. Hours crawled by like wounded things. Clara did what she could, helping Mara change positions, offering sips of water, praying under her breath. The wall clock ticked loudly in the quiet between Mara's pains. Outside, the storm howled like a living creature. Dawn approached, though the sky remained dark with clouds. Mara's strength was failing. Her coughs racked her entire body, and her fever burned hotter. Clara watched the window anxiously, searching for any sign of movement in the swirling snow. "Tell me about your grandmother," Clara said, trying to distract Mara from the pain. "The one who taught you healing herbs?" Mara's voice came weak, but clear. "She showed me how to listen to the land, said every plant has a spirit willing to help, if you approach with respect." She broke off, gritting her teeth against another contraction. "She sounds like a wise woman," Clara said, squeezing Mara's hand. "You'll teach your little one the same, won't you?" Mara nodded, tears sliding down her temples. "If we live to see morning." "Now, none of that talk," Clara chided gently. "King will bring help. You'll see." Miles away, King pushed his horse through chest-deep snow. The wind cut through his layers like knives, and ice crusted his scarf where his breath froze. His hands had gone numb hours ago, despite the thick gloves. Every few minutes, he had to brush snow from his eyes to check his bearings. He'd found Travis's horse, abandoned and half-buried in a drift, but no sign of the rider. King prayed the young man had made it to shelter somewhere. The main road was completely blocked by massive drifts, forcing King to break trail through open country. His horse stumbled, exhausted. King dismounted and led the animal on foot, breaking path through the deep snow. His own legs trembled with fatigue, but he pushed on. The thought of Mara's face, twisted in pain, drove him forward step by frozen step. Finally, after what felt like years, he saw lights through the storm, the town's main street. He stumbled into the doctor's house, nearly falling as feeling rushed back into his frozen limbs. Dr. Matthews took one look at his ice-covered form and began packing his medical bag without question. "The baby's coming too soon," King managed through chattering teeth. "She's fevered, been coughing since the fire." The doctor nodded grimly. "Let me hitch the sleigh. My horse is fresh. We'll make better time than trying to ride through these drifts." King's hand shook so badly he could barely help with the harness. His face stung where the ice had cut his skin. But soon, they were moving, the sleigh's runners cutting through the deep snow more easily than horse hooves could. The return journey was still achingly slow. King sat beside Dr. Matthews, straining to see the way through the endless white. His thoughts ran in circles of prayer and promise. "Hold on, Mara. Hold on." The storm began to ease as they approached the ranch, the sky lightening to pearl gray. They found Travis in the bunkhouse, half frozen but alive. The ranch hands helped the doctor carry his equipment to the house while King staggered to the kitchen door, his legs wooden with cold and exhaustion. Inside, Clara's face flooded with relief at the sight of them. Mara lay pale and still on the table, but her eyes fluttered open at the sound of their entrance. A ghost of a smile touched her lips when she saw King. "You came back," she whispered. "Always will," he promised, his voice rough as he took her hand. To his surprise, her fingers gripped his with surprising strength. The doctor shed his snow-covered coat and rolled up his sleeves, his experienced eyes taking in Mara's condition. "Let's see what we have here," he said gently, moving to examine her. "You've held on admirably, Mrs. McAllister. Now let's bring this little one safely into the world." King tried to step back, but Mara's grip tightened on his hand. "Stay," she breathed. "Please." He nodded, threading his still cold fingers through hers. "I'm right here." Clara busied herself heating more water and laying out clean linens while Dr. Matthews worked. Outside, the storm gradually settled into gentle snowfall, the kitchen filled with morning light, pale and pure as promise. King kept his post beside Mara, letting her crush his hand with each contraction, watching color slowly return to her face as her breathing eased under the doctor's care. His own fingers tingled painfully as feeling returned, but he welcomed the discomfort. It reminded him that they were both still alive, still fighting. The wall clock ticked steadily onward as morning crept across the sky, marking time as they waited for what would come next. "One more push," Dr. Matthews urged, his voice steady despite hours of exhaustion. The lantern light cast dancing shadows across the kitchen walls as Mara gathered her remaining strength. With a final, powerful effort, she brought their son into the world. The baby's first cry pierced the pre-dawn quiet, small but fierce like his mother. "A boy," the doctor announced, quickly checking the infant. "Small, but his lungs are strong." Clara helped clean and swaddle the tiny bundle while King supported Mara, his large hand gentle against her back. Tears streamed down Mara's face as King carefully placed their son in her arms. "Daniel," she whispered, touching the baby's cheek. "Daniel Two Rivers McAllister." She looked up at King, her dark eyes shining. "For my father, and for his heritage." King nodded, his throat too tight for words as he gazed at his son's face. The baby had Mara's copper skin and a dusting of black hair, but King saw his own mother's high cheekbones in the tiny features. Outside, snow continued to fall, wrapping the ranch house in pristine silence. Inside, the kitchen glowed with warmth and quiet joy. Dr. Matthews and Clara worked efficiently to make Mara comfortable, moving her to the downstairs bedroom where a fire blazed in the hearth. As morning light filtered through the windows, news of the birth spread through the bunkhouse. Ranch hands, still stamping snow from their boots after morning chores, came one by one to offer congratulations. They stood awkwardly in the doorway, hats in hand, speaking in hushed voices as they peered at the small bundle in the cradle. Old Amos, who rarely spoke more than 2 words together, surprised everyone by presenting a carefully whittled wooden horse. "For the boy," he mumbled, placing it on the bedside table, "when he's bigger." That evening, after Mara had drifted into exhausted sleep, King sat alone by the cradle. The lantern cast a soft glow over Daniel's peaceful face. King reached down to touch his son's tiny hand, marveling at the perfect fingers that curled reflexively around his own. "I promise you," he whispered, "you'll never know shame for who you are or where you come from. You'll have your mother's strength and your grandmother's wisdom." He paused, swallowing hard. "And I'll be a father worthy of you both." Clara found him there later, still keeping watch. She draped a blanket over his shoulders and squeezed his arm, understanding in her eyes. Together they listened to the soft breathing of mother and child, while outside, the snow transformed their world into something new and clean. The spring thaw finally cleared the mountain roads. King loaded his saddlebags with sworn statements and evidence gathered from ranch hands who'd spotted Hanley riders near the barn that fateful night. He kissed Mara and baby Daniel goodbye, then rode into town with determination set in his jaw. The territorial courthouse was packed when Judge Avery called the session to order. King presented the affidavits one by one, his voice steady as he detailed the pattern of harassment leading up to the fire. The Hanley patriarch's face grew redder with each testimony read. "These statements prove malicious intent," Judge Avery declared, shuffling through the papers. The court finds sufficient evidence to hold the Hanley outfit responsible for damages. He paused, looking sternly over his spectacles. Furthermore, all grazing leases currently held by the Hanley Ranch are hereby revoked. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The Hanleys stormed out, but others lingered, approaching King with offers of help. "We can spare some lumber," said Thompson, the mill owner. "My boys will help raise the frame." Before leaving the courthouse steps, King raised his voice to address the gathering crowd. "I have one more announcement," he said. "Half of the river tract land will be deeded back to the Cheyenne people as a trust for future generations." The declaration brought shocked silence. Some townspeople muttered disapprovingly, but others, including Reverend Haskins, nodded with clear respect. The newspaper editor scribbled furiously in his notebook. When King returned home, he found the ranch yard already filling with wagons. Neighbors had brought tools, fresh-cut timber, and baskets of food. Clara directed a group of women setting up tables for the workers, while Mara sat in a rocking chair with Daniel, watching the activity with bright eyes. "Your announcement caused quite a stir in town," she said softly as King approached. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," he replied, touching Daniel's small hand. "A promise is a promise." The barn raising brought the community together like never before. White settlers worked alongside Cheyenne men who traveled from the agency after hearing the news. Samuel Greyhawk supervised the roof framing, sharing traditional building wisdom that proved invaluable. Even the sheriff showed up with his crew. By sunset, the new barn stood tall against the spring sky, stronger than the original. Women served a feast on long tables, and children played together in the yard. King watched it all from the porch, seeing old barriers crumble like the winter's ice. The land had brought them together, just as it had brought him and Mara together, healing old wounds with each passing day. Spring arrived in full glory, painting the Montana rangeland in vibrant greens. The warm breeze carried the sweet scent of new grass as it rippled like waves across the rebuilt fence lines of the McAllister Ranch. The property stood transformed, not just by the new structures, but by the spirit of harmony that now filled the air. On the wide front porch, Mara sat in her favorite rocking chair. Little Daniel nestled contentedly in her arms. The 3-month-old boy had his mother's dark eyes and his father's strong chin. She hummed softly, an old Cheyenne lullaby her grandmother had taught her, while watching King work at the ranch's main gate post. King's skilled hands moved deliberately as he carved their son's name into the weathered wood. His knife traced each letter with care. Daniel 2 Rivers McAllister. The sound of his carving mingled with the cheerful voices of ranch hands in the yard, who were taking their midday break in the spring sunshine. Clara emerged from the house carrying a basket of fresh-baked bread that filled the air with its homey aroma. "Still warm," she called out to the workers, who gathered eagerly around the outdoor tables she'd set. The easy laughter and casual conversation between native and white ranch hands would have been unthinkable just months ago. Samuel Greyhawk's arrival added a special gravity to the afternoon. The Crow elder had become a frequent and welcome visitor to the ranch, bridging worlds just as Mara did. He approached the porch with dignified steps, his silver hair catching the sunlight. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the baby. Mara nodded, carefully passing Daniel to him. The elder first spoke in Cheyenne, his rich voice carrying ancient blessings across the spring air, then repeated them in English. "May you walk in beauty. May you know the strength of your ancestors. May you bring pride to both your peoples." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, King joined Mara on the porch. Daniel had fallen asleep in his mother's arms, his tiny fingers curled into fists. King rested his strong hand on Mara's shoulder, a gesture that held all the tenderness he'd learned to show since their first meeting in that cold auction yard. The mighty Alpha King of the territory had found something far more valuable than the vast lands he once prized above all else. In the quiet moments with his wife and son, in the peaceful unity of their blended household, in the respect he'd earned through justice rather than fear, King McAllister had discovered his true legacy, a family bound by love, and a home where all were welcome. If today's story echoed in your heart, I hope you'll stick around. Subscribe, and I'll be here again tomorrow with another story that speaks softly but stays deeply.